Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hello, we are glad you all could join us today. My name is Peter Rosen, and I am currently the mount maker here at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. I am very honored to have the privilege to be welcoming you all to the start of this collaboration between the International Mountmakers Forum and the AIC Materials Working Group, Fact Sheets Group. Looking at the registered list, it looks like we have a very impressive mix of practitioners from conservation to mount making to exhibitions, specialists, curators, design, beyond, from institutions all across the globe. So I think I speak for all of us when I say that it's really exciting to see the interest that we all share in this topic. And for reasons you'll see later in the talk, we're very glad to have you all here. And we had almost 500, maybe even more now, people register. I don't know how many we're going to get in, but that's a huge amount of interest, and that's really exciting for us. You are going to meet many of the collaborators from both sides of the International Mountmakers Forum and the Materials Working Group as we sort of introduce ourselves and each other. I'd like to also say that from the Materials Working Group, we have Jen Bosworth, who's going to be sort of running things behind the scenes here, and Elizabeth Soriano from the International Mountmaker Forum. She'll kind of also be behind the curtain, but she's those folks are deeply involved in making sure that this all goes smoothly today. But we, as a very humble subgroup, have been in conversation about this collaboration for over a year now, doing some things, testing some things out with both mount makers and conservators, doing some material testing and other things that we'll give you a recap on, but also putting together forming the boulder that we're about to send in motion today. So let's talk a little bit about why we're here today. Thankfully, the topic of materials and mount fabrication is one that's vast and constantly changing. And that's fantastic, but it reinforces the need for collaboration between communities like IMF and the Materials Working Group, so that we can kind of host these moments of reflection within our communities. And we felt like the best way that we could tackle such a broad subject is to break it into smaller forums with more refined purposes or topics so that we can discuss things openly in a more focused way. So what is the thematic focus today? Well, today is basically our launching point. So broadly, today is a rally call for all those interested in the topic. And obviously, you all have answered that call, and that's fantastic. And we decided that the best theme to start with today is the theme of collaboration. So specifically collaboration between mount makers, conservators, and other museum stakeholders when it comes to selecting materials for mount fabrication. Today we'll focus on the meaningful and functional beauty of the gray areas in material selection and the deeply considered conversations that are had between conservators and mount makers as we sort of inch towards a completed project, drawing upon objectivity and empirical research, but also embracing necessary subjectivity within our decision-making process. The aim of this meeting will be to highlight our support for each other and ignite future summits on isolated material relevant topics. So like I said, this is just the beginning. And since we have a lot of speakers, which is great, and a lot of folks joining us, I will sort of give you a general overview of the flow for today. We're going to have a brief update on material testing related collaborations. And then we're going to move into some flash talks, very quick flash talks and anecdotes of collaborative projects. So we can highlight those gray areas without explicitly talking about what they are, because who knows what they are? They're pretty amorphous. And then we're going to move into a semi-structured panel question and answer session where we can have some of those conversations. And finally, I'll end with what our next steps are going to be for this collaboration so that you all know what to expect in the future, so that you can join us for those moments as well and help sort of populate those moments with content. You can use the agenda from the International Mountmakers Forum website to follow along to see where we're at. Right now, we're just at Peter Rosen, #1. And I am going to pass it on now to Shelly Uhlir. She is also part of the International Mountmakers Forum as well as the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. And she'll be giving you an update on a recent survey many of you may have encountered, especially Mountmakers, but potentially some of the conservators in the group. And she can go from here. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So nice to see all these friendly and familiar faces out there. I was getting mesmerized by that, so I'll try to remember to do my talk now. So, sorry, first I need to, some technical things here. There we go. All right, so last fall, we held an International Mountmakers Forum gathering in Boston, where I talked a little bit about a deep dive we took into mount coating exploration. It was a big collaborative effort, from surveying all of you on your mount coating use to working with the AIC Materials Working Group Fact Sheet Committee members to test multiple materials, but it really turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. When we knew that we would be continuing to work together to create this event, it just made sense to include you all again with another survey. This time on the kinds of barriers, paddings, and coatings that you use or are most interested in discussing right now. I want to share the results of that survey with you today. So, as of March 31st, we had received 69 responses, which I think is pretty great. This QR code takes you to a spreadsheet with the results of the survey, names and email addresses removed. I really appreciate everybody who took the time to answer these questions so thoughtfully and thoroughly. And a special shout out to Jody Hansen and Alessandro Scola, who took the time to be interviewed on their mount material experiences as well. There's a lot in here, and I think it's fun to look at, but I want to take a couple of minutes to summarize each question also. So first of all, we just generally asked what you all are already using. I love that some of you sent very specific information that will be super helpful in the future for deciding on what to test next. For my own sanity, I split these results into families. While we see many old friends in these lists, there were a few materials that I have not heard of or have not used before, so that was very exciting. And we may be reaching out to some of you for more detailed information as we move forward also. The second obvious question was, have these materials been conservation tested in any way? You can see that almost 2/3 have been tested, mostly using the Oddy test, which is great. But I realized that we neglected to ask if they had actually passed the test. So this might be a bit of a trick answer in some cases. A quarter of these had not been tested, but the reasons cited were mostly some version of this is the industry standard, or they had been tested by others. And so that's kind of what all those general ones are there. Next, we asked your thoughts about mount making materials that you might be interested in having tested. About half of the respondents had some ideas there. Again, I found myself needing to categorize the responses and appreciated the specifics that some of you shared. Between this list and the previous one, I can begin to see, or we can all begin to see, a few families to explore a little bit further testing-wise or practical-wise, as well as a few specific products to begin to look at. And finally, we asked for your stories. Has mount making material either harmed or helped an item it was supporting? A tough and resolute group of 17 hardy souls stuck around to answer that one. Now, I know this is a lot to look at, and this isn't even all the responses, but don't worry, it's all on the spreadsheet. And I find this all interesting, and it brings up some good conversation starters about materials weathering the length of exhibitions and stresses brought to the material that could be alleviated through mount design, as well as good questions about multiple material interactions. But there were a few positives where the mount protected the items from issues with other case materials, where no interaction had occurred despite being on display for years, and just plain liking the material. So that's the brief summary of what we've gathered so far. Here again is the code that takes you to the summary spreadsheet. Thank you again to all who have participated so far. What happens next will be a result of our conversations today and really digging in on details from the survey. By the way, the survey is still live, so it's not too late to get your thoughts and ideas to us or to update what you've already entered. Or if you prefer, you can always contact us through the IMF email, which is there on the screen, contactmountforum@gmail.com. And now we're going to move on to the testing introduction portion of the day with Megan Salas sharing existing online resources. Thank you, Megan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. I wanted to add one thing. So since I am one of the people that will be running the Q&A panel, we will be looking for questions in the chat, as well as if people got a jump start and sent any into the email address that was connected to the registration. So we won't be answering questions as we go, but save them for the panel or submit them in the chat right now. So what I'm going to do now is just provide a very brief glimpse at some online resources that many of you probably know about already. But okay, so this is not exhaustive by any means, but here are a few resources. Sorry, I'm doing some technical things. So I wanted to start with just, this is the AIC wiki. And this just gives an overview of all like everything that's on the AIC wiki. But I wanted to draw your attention down here to choosing materials for storage, exhibition, and transport. Click this link. And this has a lot of useful information here. And the great thing about the wiki is that it's very like interconnected. There are a lot of hyperlinks that will take you to other relevant pages. And that's the thing about a lot of these online resources is different groups are working on different things. And so different information exists in different places. There's definitely an effort to try and link all of that in some way. To the extent, to what extent it's actually linked, I think that's always a work in progress. But I thought I would take you on a little, so here it gives an overview of different factors to consider when you're choosing materials. And I think one of our later speakers has a link to this in their presentation, but if you want to learn more about the materials working group, which is a subgroup of the materials working group, is one of the groups that organized this forum. I'm not going to click it, but there's a link that'll describe the group more and the subgroups and all of the activities we're involved in. But I did want to highlight, so here there's a link to the AIC materials testing wiki page. And since we're in this testing section here, and we'll hear from a couple folks soon about specific types of testing, this page provides an overview of different types of testing, microchemical testing, and then there's some more resources here that link to other things. Most of you are probably familiar with the Oddy test. This is the wiki page on the Oddy test. This is kind of it's like a never-ending rabbit hole. You can just keep clicking links and finding information basically, but this is a description of the Oddy test, and then probably what a lot of you are familiar with is the results table. So this is where you go when you want to find how a certain product performed on the Oddy test. And it's loading, but it's loading slowly. Probably because I'm sharing. I would like to show this, but I don't know why it's taking so long. Well, I can move on and come back to this if it loads. So let's see if there's anything else on there are other good resources on the wiki. For example, this is kind of maybe less information on specific materials, but general considerations when planning an exhibit. So this has a lot of helpful information, including tech notes, which should be linked down here, which go into more specific kind of like case studies for certain situations. Now my internet's very unhappy. But I'll move on to other things. So some of you are probably also familiar with Cameo, which is like a collaborative effort. It was originally started at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, but there's a database on Cameo that has really great information about varieties of materials. And so you can see some of the different groups of materials here. And if, for example, we click, I don't know if so we put together some, I've been part of the group that's been working on compiling some of this information about specific products and putting it into comparison tables. So, you know, products that maybe have the same chemical makeup, but slight differences in, you know, what thickness they come in or what color. This information is compiled nicely in some of these tables that can be helpful when trying to compare one product to another. And then there are, of course, like the individual entries on Cameo that provide like just more information about that specific product, including collections risks, which is what we are probably most interested in. Let me see if I also included here on the Mountmaking IMF website under toolbox, there's a materials link, and there's information here about certain materials commonly used in Mountmaking. I do want to add that my IMF colleagues there are colleagues that are working hard on updating this, the content and the format it's presented in, but this is how it is now. And as you can see, there's a Cameo link. So like I said, we're always trying to make things interconnected so these things don't exist in isolation. Let me see if try this one more time to show you the results table for the Oddy test. Okay, here we go. So this is probably looks familiar to a lot of you. This is the results table on the Oddy wiki. And so on the left here, you have the product and then more information. The date tested is an important thing to pay attention to. So yeah, you can, there's some of the entries have photos, and I think Devin will be talking a little bit more about what all these results mean, but this is a very helpful resource. It is searchable also with this search bar here. I'm not going to try it because I think my internet will be unhappy, but this is infinitely useful. I think I will stop with that. Like I said, there's a ton more resources out there. These are just some of the ones I wanted to highlight today. And yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Devin Lee, who is going to provide an introduction to Oddy testing.
Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay, you can all see that. Great. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Devin Lee, and I'm a fourth-year graduate student at the Conservation Center of the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. And I just have a few minutes, so I'll be giving you a brief overview of the Oddy test, why and how we use it to make decisions, and how the materials working group is working to navigate and mitigate some of the test's limitations. So to begin, the Oddy test is a benchtop accelerated corrosion test that was originally developed by Andrew Oddy at the British Museum in the 1970s. There are many procedural variants of the Oddy test, and I'll touch on that in more detail shortly, but in general, the Oddy test is a subjective method for assessing whether materials such as gaskets, adhesives, paints, fabrics, other materials related to mount making, display case construction, and graphics are suitable for use in an enclosed airspace with artworks, specimens, and other cultural heritage items. The Oddy test is used to detect the presence of potentially harmful volatile constituents in these materials that can pose a risk to collections during transportation, display, and storage. And the images on the slide here represent a few examples of damages inflicted on collections items by contact with or exposure to airspaces shared with unsuitable materials. More examples can be found on the AIC MWG Materials Working Group Wiki page that Megan just described. And damages such as these can be prevented by screening materials with the Oddy test. And how the test works generally is that a small sample of the material, say a gasket or a fabric, like in the image, is placed in a sealable container. 3 metal coupons, one each of copper, silver, and lead, are exposed to the headspace above the material sample. The image on the slide here is an example of an Oddy test assembly. The material sample is sealed in a container beneath the suspended metal coupons alongside an open vial of water, which brings the interior of the assembly to about 95 to 100% relative humidity, while the assembly is held at 60 degrees Celsius for 28 days. The high temperature and relative humidity inside the assembly accelerate the potential off-gassing of the material, and an identical container with 3 metal coupons but no material sample serves as a control. So after 28 days, the metal coupons are assessed by a trained practitioner in comparison to the control coupons, and a rating is assigned to the material based on any observed changes to the metal coupons. So if a coupon looks very similar to the respective metal control coupon with no discernible corrosion, it earns a P rating, which stands for permanent, and it means that the material is safe for use indefinitely in the presence of collections. At the first sign of corrosion, the coupon is relegated to the T category, which stands for temporary and means that the material is safe for use near but not in contact with collection items for up to 6 months. More extreme corrosion of the coupon may earn a U rating, which stands for unsuitable and means that the material is not safe for use in contact with or near collections items, and ideally another material should be selected. The 3 coupons in a single test assembly might have different PTU ratings, so the overall rating of the material is the worst of the 3 coupon ratings. The temporary range is a little elusive, as are the thresholds between P and T and T and U, and Julia will be elaborating on that in the next flash talk, so I'll just leave it at that for now. And I will say that we do understand that these corrosion products can indicate exposure to particular compounds. For example, copper is susceptible to corrosion when exposed to chlorides, oxides, and sulfur compounds. Silver can detect reduced sulfur compounds, and lead corrosion may indicate the presence of organic acids, aldehydes, and acidic gases. However, at the end of the day, the Oddy test is a subjective qualitative method of evaluation, and you would need to analyze your material sample using an analytical technique like GCMS to conclusively identify and quantify the volatile constituents of a material. So as it stands, is the right slide? Yes. As it stands, the Oddy test is a relatively low cost and accessible method of screening materials, and results are widely shared through the AIC materials testing wiki, as Megan just described. And I've included a QR code in the bottom right corner that will take you to the results, the testing results page, which includes a robust table in which you can search for materials that have been evaluated using the Oddy test. It's an excellent resource, and while you are perusing it, I would like to also draw your attention to the prominent disclaimer in the yellow highlighted box, in which we state, in essence, that these results are to be considered with some nuance. We have found, for example, that manufacturers occasionally reformulate their products without notice, and materials, particularly those with test results that are more than 2 years old and definitely more than 5 years old, may need to be retested to reflect current formulations. Additionally, we state that the results in this table are not peer-reviewed or vetted, which brings us back to the point I raised earlier about the many procedural variants of the Oddy test. So the Oddy test has undergone many revisions and modifications since it was developed in the 1970s, and a 2014 survey by Elena Torak and Joelle Wickens identified at least 20 distinct procedural variations across, I think, 31 institutions in the US alone at that time. And whether containers are sealed with lids or stoppers, what coupon hangers are made of, how tight the containers are, how the metal coupons are polished, down to the eyesight of the person assessing the coupons. The Oddy test and its results are sensitive to all of these differences in experimental procedure and user subjectivity. So, in an effort to address some frustrations about the variability of results and to standardize Oddy testing, as well as GCMS and microchemical testing, the Materials Working Group Volunteer Network has conducted round robins about every other year since 2019. And in these round robins, the same materials are tested at different institutions by different users using agreed upon protocols, and the results are compared to assess the repeatability and reproducibility of the different procedures. It's an ongoing conversation, and the 2024 round robin is currently in progress, and the round robin results can help us to identify areas of weakness in the test that can be improved to increase its accuracy and real-world applicability. The Oddy test takes a full month to complete, and it is labor and resource intensive, so it's in everybody's best interest, especially those working on tight construction or exhibition timelines, for the Oddy test to be a reliable screen for volatile chemicals. And ultimately, the real-world applicability is the goal of Oddy testing. Anyone who works with collections must understand that we all need to be thinking about material sensibilities or sensitivities and compatibilities. And likewise, those who are behind the scenes doing materials testing must take into consideration the importance of the physical or working properties of the materials: rigidity, color, machinability, adhesive strength, things like that. And all of these factors come into play in the selection of potential products for use in contact or proximity with collections. So we have to communicate to understand each other's goals and find common ground and acceptable compromises. And the best Oddy test is not necessarily the most stringent, but it is the one that best reflects the real world application of the materials being tested. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Julia Bacher-Arkema. Thank you.
Okay, I'm hoping that you can hear me and see my screen.
Julia, we see your note screen.
Okay. Oh no, how do I swap?
If you have two screens, you should be able to, I think, drag your presentation to the other screen.
Oh no. A minute.
Looks good.
All looks good.
Okay, so is that now the presentation and not the notes screen?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Julia Bacher-Arkema. I'm an associate research scientist here at the Met. And I'm going to talk a little bit. Sorry? Oh, I think maybe somebody is just unmuted, but I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Oddy benchmarking project taking place at the Met, which is an IMLS funded project. Rest in peace. But I think before I really get into the Oddy benchmarking overview, I want to talk about GCMS testing in particular and how we can relate GCMS data to Oddy test corrosion results, because that's really at the heart of the Oddy benchmarking project. Okay, so Devin brought up a few of these, let's say, downfalls of the Oddy test or complexities. It takes a long time, 28 days plus analysis. It can be subjective. It lacks chemical specificity. We don't have a complete idea of which chemicals lead to which types of corrosion. It's also limited to corrosive reactions on the surface of the coupons. We can't see reactions that might damage paper or plastic or other types of substrates. And the ratings are not inherently correlated to the concentration of whatever chemical is present in the off-gassing of a given material. And so some of the ways that GCMS as an analysis technique can address those downfalls are, it can be shorter. It takes about 2 hours to conduct a material test by GCMS, plus the analysis time, which can vary, but it's shorter in general. It has the potential to be more objective, though it does require a trained practitioner to analyze the results. It can give us specific chemical information about which species are coming out of a material, and that's the real strength of GCMS testing. That's has the potential to be incredibly powerful. It has a much broader range of analytes that it can detect. So whereas in the Oddy test, we're limited to corrosive reactions, the GC system has the potential to detect a much, much wider range of chemicals. And there's also a potential for semi-quantitation. And so I'm not going to go a ton into this idea, but if we could know exactly how much of a chemical causes a problem, that would be really powerful for us to understand which materials are okay to use and which materials are not okay to use. So GCMS has the potential to effectively address all of these issues. But I do want to point out before I move on that one of the major weaknesses with the GCMS analytical technique is that there's no inherent link to observed damage. So in an Oddy test, regardless of the variability from test to test, from institution to institution, there is a visible link to damage caused on the surface of those coupons, whereas on the GCMS, we can see this huge range of chemicals, but we need to make really thoughtful determinations and interpretations about which of those chemicals can be harmful and how much of those chemicals can be harmful. So I just want you to keep that in mind as I move through the next couple of slides. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I just want to point out that GCMS testing is taking place at a whole host of institutions, many of which have people here at this forum today. So you might have already encountered GCMS data for materials testing. You might have done it yourself. It's definitely happening, even though the Oddy test is, I would say, much more omnipresent in the field. GCMS is widely used. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time going into the nitty-gritty of this method, but essentially what you should know is compared to Oddy testing, where you use 2 grams, which I would say is a relatively large amount of a material. In GCMS testing, you just use a tiny sample. This is a picture of I believe this was a piece of a carpet maybe being tested. And so you can see it's about 10 to 15 milligrams. It's quite small. And you use heat to thermally desorb all of the molecules that you can at a certain temperature from that material into a mass spectrometer. And the mass spectrometer gives us that specific chemical information about the volatile emissions coming out of the material. And so to give you a sense, this is what the data look like. So this is a GC chromatogram of this Davy board, a single ply book board, a conservation material. And you can see it's really complex data. It's not just, you know, a copper, a silver, and a lead coupon that look good, bad, or terrible. It's specific chemical peaks. You can see there are hundreds of peaks in this chromatogram. Each one, in theory, corresponds to a specific chemical emission. And it's up to us to figure out what those emissions are and to think about how they might be compatible or incompatible with the collections where they'll be used. And so I'm going to go through 3 examples. They're simplified examples, but I'm just going to show you how we think about GCMS as a complement to Oddy testing. So I'll show you the Oddy testing results, and then talk about some of the conclusions that we've made through the direct thermal desorption GCMS testing of those materials. And so this Davy board that I've already mentioned is the first material that I'm going to talk about. You can see the Oddy results for Davy board here. It's pretty unsuitable. We can see that there's corrosion, pretty extreme corrosion present for copper, silver, and lead. Based on past work and literature, as Devin mentioned earlier, we tend to see pretty, it can be pretty extreme corrosion on lead when organic acids, acetic acid, formic acid, and others are present. And we've also, you know, as a community for a while, we've known that silver corrosion, specifically this purple silver tarnish that you can see in the image, can be related to the presence of reduced sulfides. And so again, here's that GC chromatogram, and through the analytical process of this data, if you zoom into the first 4 minutes of the GC chromatogram, you can see peaks that have been assigned to acetic acid here. And in the larger chromatogram, that's the largest peak in the chromatogram. So there's quite a bit of acid here. And then you can also see other acids, and I'm showing here propanoic acid, which is also present. So we can kind of link that lead corrosion to those organic acids. And similarly, I don't show the zoom in for the sulfides, but we detected trace methane thiol, which is a reduced sulfide molecule, and dimethyl ethyl thiophene. And so we can start to draw these connections between, okay, what's the Oddy test result and which specific molecules are responsible for the corrosion that we're seeing. So this is a bad material. But I want to show you an example of a better material. I thought this could be interesting because this was a material that I tested for one of our mount makers here at the Met. It's known as Plascoat Vitrogard. I think it goes by many different names. It's a transparent coating, so I don't have a picture of it here. It's difficult to image, but it tested quite well in 2 tests. It got PPP and PPT, so permanent and temporary. But you can see it's kind of night and day compared to the extreme tarnish that I showed on the previous slide. So if this is the Oddy test result, let's look at the GCMS results. Overall, you can tell there are far fewer peaks present in the chromatogram, which tells me that there are fewer volatiles that are being evolved from this material. And of the peaks that we did detect, they didn't represent reactive molecules. And so that's really important. We don't only have to see what volatiles are there, we have to think about whether they are reactive based on our chemical intuition and the literature, and whether they have the potential to damage objects when they come into contact. And so we have the Oddy test that, you know, gives us a decent result. And then we can look into the chemical data using GCMS to try and pair those 2 sets of data together. And then finally, this is I don't know how to say it, Keem Optal White. This is a mineral paint that we tested. You can see it's a mixed bag here, but we have pretty extreme copper tarnish. And unfortunately, whereas we have a lot of information from past work and literature to understand acid tarnish of lead and sulfide tarnish of silver, we don't understand all of the discrete chemical pathways that lead to copper corrosion. So interestingly, when you look at the GCMS chromatogram, it's very complex. There are a ton of peaks. They're quite large. And a lot of them correspond to amines. And amines are these molecules. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's like a nitrogen and a hydrogen, and they can be a variety of different structures, I'll just say, and they tend to act as corrosion inhibitors. So this is something of a mystery. We haven't been able to connect the dots between which chemicals are coming out of the material and which chemicals are causing the tarnish during the Oddy test. And so you can see, even though we get a lot of chemical information, it's really the interpretation step that connects what we're seeing in our chromatogram to the damage that we're witnessing during the Oddy test. And so just to tie that all together, when we think about using GCMS to make decisions during materials testing, GCMS can give us really meaningful chemical insight, but currently it's predominantly used as a complement here at the Met to Oddy testing rather than as a standalone test. But when making a final decision for material suitability based on materials testing, you have to think about so many different factors. You have to think about the length of the exposure. How long is this material going to be installed in an exhibition? How close is it to the objects that are involved? Is it inside the art envelope or outside the art envelope? How compatible is it chemically with the objects on display? How much material is being used, a tiny amount or a huge carpet filling an entire room? More material means more emissions. Plus, of course, functionality, budget, aesthetics, so many considerations. And so it really is a nuanced and complex decision-making process, as I'm sure you all know. Finally, I'm just going to quickly step through how this all relates to Oddy benchmarking. And so to give you a sense of where we're going with this project, we're trying to really connect the dots between Oddy testing and GCMS testing. We're trying to, create a bridge between those two methods. And the way that we're going about this, first a team of conservators conducted a survey of a bunch of materials that are used frequently in the field, and they assigned ratings to those materials, not based on their Oddy test results, but based on their functionality and use within the field. So they have an Oddy test result and a field performance result. The next step is using GCMS, as I've described, to identify and quantify chemicals of interest. So this would be reactive chemicals coming out of materials that might be responsible for the tarnish during the Oddy test. And then using that information to connect what we see during material Oddy tests, we can add those chemicals that we identify as chemicals of interest directly to an Oddy jar to mimic or replicate the tarnish we view during the Oddy test. So steps 2 and 3 are really done in parallel. That's what we're working on right now. And our final goal is to generate benchmarking solutions that, as Devin mentioned, these boundaries are what are important. Where do we switch from a permanent material to a temporary material, and a temporary material to an unsuitable material? And really, we want this to be connected to the real field performance of these materials so that we have a good sense of which are off-gassing harmful chemicals, which are safe to use, and why. What are the chemicals that are responsible, and can we sort of standardize our tests by defining those boundaries? Okay, I think that's all I have. Thank you so much. How do
Great. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Devin. Thank you, Megan. We are now going to start to switch into a new gear of thinking and talking and presenting about this topic. And we're moving into the flash talk portion. You can already see from the introductions that were just given about where we're at with different testing projects is that there is that nuance and that subjectivity in our tests. And that gray area that I was discussing earlier is something that is, already becoming evident. And the flash talks here are really designed to highlight that even further. These are going to be intentionally brief. We only gave these poor folks 8 minutes to talk about all the great projects that they're working on. And that is going to be so that we can kind of save a lot of the questions and conversation to the Q&A panel at the end, but also keep these conversations moving forward into the months ahead. So again, I can already see there's a bunch of great questions hitting our chat, and we are aggregating those, and we're going to pull those back out at the Q&A portion at the end. So please continue to just ask your questions as they come in the chat, and then we'll make sure that the panelists get them at the very end. So I'm going to briefly introduce our group of flash talkers. First is going to be Shelly Uhlir again of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, talking about some experiments that she's been doing with mountain coatings. Then it's going to be Pierre-Luc Bruyette at the MNBAQ in Quebec, who's going to be discussing his work with Larapal and using it as a mount coating and painting technique, which is really great. Then BJ Farrar of the Getty is going to be talking about his collaboration with his team identifying 3D printed materials at the Getty. Kelly Stoneburner is going to be next from the Library of Congress, talking about all the research that they did. I understand it was quite a bit of testing on spray paints and primers and some of the things that they found through that process, which for the mount makers in the group, it's going to be something that you're going to want to be paying attention to. Hopefully there's some good news in the mix. We'll see. And then finally, it'll be Susan Held and Beth Holford of the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, talking about their recommended materials list, how that was formed, that's specific to mounts and mount fabrication. And so they can kind of delve into that collaborative process. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shelly to get started with mixing it up.
Well, hi, everybody again. I remain Shelly Uhlir. And in this talk, I'd like to share a follow-up from the mount coating collaboration that we talked about at last year's International Mountmakers Forum. I mentioned this earlier, but that presentation summarized current trends in mount coating use, questioned whether and when we even need to coat brass mounts, and examined results of various scientific and practical tests on currently used sprays and dip recipes. This was the result of a deep collaboration between mount makers, conservators, and scientists from NMAI, the IMF, and the members of the AIC Materials Working Group Fact Sheet Committee, as well as from existing information on the AIC Materials Testing Wiki site and in Cameo. If you're interested in watching that talk, we'll put a link in the chat to catch up on all that. So at that talk, I noted several follow-up goals that we had for continuing these collaborations, one of which was a deeper dive into 4 mount coating recipes. Paraloid B72, because this is already commonly used in our field. B67, because I was curious about its hardness and sheen. B48N, because it's a paraloid that's formulated to adhere to metals, so that seemed like a good one to test. And Larapal A81, because we had liked its properties from the earlier Gamvar gloss test, and I wanted to try a non-proprietary recipe. We chose to use the 70-30 acetone ethanol solvent mix because the ethanol slows the evaporation rate for a slightly longer working time with fewer bubbles than the acetone alone. We wanted to compare these 4 solutions for ease of application, amount of bubbling, adherence to the metal, flexibility, and ease of applying acrylic finish paint. Another goal was to share how easy it is for mount makers to mix these solutions themselves even if they don't work at an institution or have access to a science lab. For years, I was intimidated to try to mix these myself because I thought it required magical techniques and equations that you could only gain through a conservation study. But after working directly with Beth Holford, one of our object conservators at NMAI, I learned that the process is really pretty straightforward. The worst that can happen is that the solution gets too thick or too thin or too gloppy, and if that happens, it's easy to adjust. For mount making purposes, it's more like making stew than making pastry. To minimize equipment, supplies, and cleanup needed, we chose the tea bag method for these experiments. There are already lots of articles and YouTube videos about ways to do this from both the conservation and fossil prep and actually piano tuning communities, but today I'd like to share what Beth and I did. So here's the setup we used. We used materials and supplies that were already in our lab, but if we were starting absolutely from scratch, I estimated that it would cost about $150 to get everything needed, including all equipment and supplies. But if you only need the resins and solvents, it would be about $30, which would last a long time and make many batches. I don't have time to go through the itemized list right now, but I'm happy to send it to you if you're interested. But pretty much it's the things that you see in these pictures. So we used this old scale because the fancy one was on the fritz, but you can use a kitchen scale too, anything that weighs in grams. The fanciest tool here, from my point of view, is the scoopula, which costs about $3 and is really nice for measuring a pellet at a time when needed. And I can think of other uses for it too, but it made me very happy to discover. The calculating and measuring can seem challenging if you haven't done it before, so let's walk through that. First of all, you decide how much you want to mix. In our case, we were mixing 50 milliliters in each jar. Second, you decide the percentage of resin that you want to add. Lower solutions like 5 or 10% are often used in conservation for coatings or consolidants. This can help control ultimate sheen and surface darkening for their work. The idea is that it's better to apply thin than thick because you can always add, but you can't easily take it off. But in this brass coating application, a slightly thicker coating can be useful, so we aimed for a 20% solution. To determine the amount of resin pellets to create the solution, you multiply volume, which is in this milliliters of solvent, by the solution desired, which in our case was 20%, to get the weight of the resin pellets needed. So since our volume was 50 milliliters and we wanted 20% or 0.20, those multiplied by each other become 10 grams of resin pellets for each jar. And after Beth taught me how to do that, she happily walked away to let me fend for myself. So essentially she taught a mount maker to mix, which I am forever grateful for. For the tea bags, we use this medical gauze with a loose weave just tight enough to carry the pellets without them falling through. The finished packet needs to be long enough to just touch the solvent at the top and then come together outside the jar. So in our case, we used an 8-inch or 20 centimeter square piece for each solution. We held them together with a rubber band at the top, which goes outside the jar. And the fiddly part is getting the bags to just touch the top of the solvent without being completely submerged. This helps the resin to just kind of be drawn into the solvent instead of, if you just put it all in one time, you could just get a big clump of resin. And I mean, I suppose eventually it would dissolve, but it might take longer and not be as clean. But anyway, this is the way that we did it. And once the bag sits right on top of the solvent, we flatten and smooth the gauze along the top of the jar so that the lid can screw on tightly. Almost immediately, we could start to see the resin strings melting into the solvent. You can especially see this in the B67 example. After a few hours, the bags were empty and the pellets dissolved, but to be safe, I waited overnight before moving to the next step. So I applied each mixture to clean test brass. Each set had one 3/32 or 2.4 millimeter rod, which I fully dipped once, then waited a minute and then dipped the top little bit 1/2 inch or 2 centimeters in a second time. I wanted to see the difference of thickness of the material. Then there was a bent strap that was just dipped once in the solution. Then a second bent strap that I dipped twice and then inserted into the foam at an angle to see how it would pool at the tip of the mount. And then a wider strap with the mixture applied in a fairly thick sloppy coat to see how brush strokes would level and bubble and, you know, I just basically do their worst kind of. And finally, a Mylar strip to really test the flexibility and cracking and sheen and transparency and all that. I had also set the used tea bags in the fume hood to see how long they would take to dry. It was really fast. After an hour, none were sticky except for the Larapol A81. After 4 hours, I couldn't smell anything on any of them. After a 1-day check, all the bags were fully dry with no scent at all. All the mixtures were pretty kind of watery at first and were very easy to apply, all very similar in that way. Note that when the jar is open, the acetone or the solvents will evaporate quickly, so the mixture won't stay watery long. So keep the lid on if you're not using it. But you can add solvent back to get whatever viscosity you need. Again, it's stew, not pastry, for mount making anyway. So how did these compare to each other? Honestly, after bending and painting, they all really did fine. So if you already use one of these and it works for you, there's no need to stop. But now we have a palette of additional choices depending on the effect desired. From my experiments, the Larapol A81 offered fewer bubbles and a satiny sheen, which I think will be very useful in my future work. That's the one on the far right. The B67, that's the second from the left, offered it offered a little bit more shine, which was not surprising. So in the situations where you need that, then that could be useful. The B48N, which was the farthest left, it's also pretty shiny. It does adhere to the brass slightly better than the others when I kind of either ran my fingernail or a scribe over it. And yeah, so my original goal of finding a less toxic dip coating recipe for my mounts was more than successful in my opinion. If you saw the original talk, I had been using xylene as my solvent because I liked how it flowed, but no more of that. Bye-bye xylene. There's no way that these discoveries would have been possible without collaborating with conservation colleagues. Absolutely. So thank you, thank you, thank you, especially to Beth, who patiently set me up for being scientist for a day. I realize that I zoomed through all of this today, but if you have any questions or want to share your own experiments, I know some of you out there are playing with your own recipes. There are folks at Fine Minerals in New Jersey who are trying different things on stainless steel mounts also. Please feel free to contact us, and thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone. I'm BJ Farrar. I'm a senior mount maker in the Decorative Arts and Sculpture Conservation Department at the Getty Museum here in Los Angeles. I'm going to do a brief overview of how we've been utilizing 3D printed materials here at the Getty Museum. The Antiquities and Decorative Arts and Sculpture Conservation departments in the museum have been utilizing working with 3D technology for over the last 15 years. This began early on with an exploration of seeing if we could model some basic stress analysis on certain object shapes, but this eventually led us working into 3D scanning, modeling, and printing. It soon became apparent how this technology could benefit mount making due to the large number of loan exhibitions we have and our need to provide adequate seismic mounts. 3D scanning, modeling, and printing seem to be an efficient method of acquiring accurate dimensional information that would allow us to design and fabricate mounts in advance without having the artwork. We've been successfully employing this workflow for over the last 10 years and have printed hundreds of mounts, or sorry, not mounts, models to make mounts to work. Not only does this method allow us to have the majority of the work done prior to an installation, but it also minimizes handling of the artwork from the mount making process all the way to doing case layouts, which our curators like quite a bit. All of the object models are printed using PLA plastic, which is very easy to print with and is recyclable. Unfortunately, it doesn't pass Oddy tests. Based on other listed Oddy tests, ABS plastic seems to pass. We've tested both a white and a black ABS filament from a company called Ultimaker. The black did not fully pass, but the white did, fortunately. Having this material passed opened up a whole new area of 3D printing possibilities, especially for conservation. All of our prior experience with scanning, modeling, and printing for mount making provided a natural segue of collaboration with our conservators on various projects and treatments. Exponentially, each project opens new doors to future projects. In this example, a replacement foot was conceived for the silver Roman cup. Based off of this reference drawing, the profile curve was recreated and modeled to create a 3D part in Rhino, which is a 3D modeling software, and then printed in ABS plastic. We were also able to incorporate a threaded insert into the foot, which allows a discrete method of securing the artwork to the display furniture. This example shows the use of 3D printed elements to replace many losses on this ornately carved frame. This project taught us the usefulness of the 3D modeling process called Boolean. Using this method, an existing detail was scanned along with the areas of loss on the frame. Then the two elements were digitally aligned. Once the proper orientation was achieved, the bottom section of the replacement part was virtually modeled or virtually molded to the areas of the loss using this Boolean technique, creating a part that would fit with the proper registration and requiring minimal adjustments. This tricky treatment of 14 cast latex breasts necessitated a method of creating a conformal fa-shaped support inserts for each breast after the treatment process. Due to the fragility, the breasts could not be used to create these inserts. But after some experimentation, we found that highly accurate molds of each breast could be achieved by scanning and modeling using the Boolean process again, which facilitated the creation of these conformal fitting fa-shaped inserts without using the fragile parts. The successes of using the Boolean method in these past projects has recently led us down another road in mount making. For years, we've been using internal mounting systems and hollow artworks, which have accessible interiors, using epoxy resins to cast conformal parts. These invisible mounts are highly effective, but are time-consuming and can be very tricky to accomplish. After some experimenting, we found that we can create these conformal parts using 3D scanning. And of course, my favorite modeling process, the Boolean, to create these conformal parts from 3D prints and we can do this in advance of an exhibition, and we can do it without the potential pitfalls of resin, and the parts can be easily adjusted if necessary. While this is a new method for us, we're taking full advantage of it and have successfully used it in multiple exhibitions so far. The 3D industry is constantly improving at every level and is becoming more accessible, opening up new possibilities. We're always learning and looking for new ways we can improve. The advancement in 3D printers and filaments hold a lot of promise, and we hope to be looking into a number of these materials in the near future, with our fingers crossed that some of these will get positive results in our Oddy tests. I would love to hear from others who have looked into similar materials and techniques that I've just been talking about. And lastly, I'd like to emphasize the importance of collaboration and information sharing like today's event. There's so much to learn from each other, and I greatly appreciate everyone sharing their thoughts on this. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
All right, let's get my talk up. Ooh. All righty. So, yeah, I'm Kelly Stoneburner. I'm with the Library of Congress in the Preservation Research and Testing Division. Want to talk about a project that was part of our testing of the materials used to build the mount. Oops, let me get a laser cleaner. The mounts here for our treasures gallery that opened up about over the summer. So this was testing that we did last winter, and I need to go ahead and just right now give a shout out to Nancy Lev Alexander, who is colleague in the conservation division, although now retired. She was critical to the process of all of this and having discussions of how to progress when perhaps some samples didn't or materials didn't perform as ideally as we would have wanted. A little bit of context about the data I'm going to be showing. Although there was a fantastic intro on both these techniques already, but whenever we do our testing for building exhibit cases or storage spaces, we do both Oddy testing and thermal desorption GCMS testing. We do the typical 3-in-1, although of course it's our variant method of it. But then also doing the GCMS testing, which for us involves taking average 15 milligram sample, although I'll be focusing on some spray paint primers today. So that wound up being spray paint sprayed out on some aluminum foil, and we just need 3 hole punches of that to do this testing. Those material samples get introduced into the thermal absorption unit, so a little red box here for us. Heat up to 90 C so that any volatile components that might come off over the lifetime of the material get off-gassed, collected onto the inlet, and then at the end of that 30-minute absorption period, introduced to the GCMS, where they're separated into their individual chemical components, and the mass spectrometer allows us to identify them, and we are semi-quantitative, getting the relative concentrations of each of these different components. We really like doing both these techniques in tandem. Sometimes the GCMS will catch things that Oddy misses and vice versa. And the GCMS, our methodology is about an hour and a half to run a sample. So it's a great early detection of what might be a problem child that we can't wait a whole month, especially with our exhibit deadlines tend to be pretty fast, and we'd get really behind if we were relying on just the Oddy test. So for part of the Treasures Gallery Mountmaking exhibit, they really wanted to paint the plinths to match the color scheme. We had about 3 different spray paint primers submitted to us. Volatiles testing, first thing typically do, immediately threw a couple of red flags for us. The first being that our total concentration of everything is, well, it's not the highest that we've ever seen for material. It's definitely higher than we would like it to be. A quote, like good paint tends to be more in the hundreds part per million rather than the thousands. The second and perhaps a little bit brighter red flag is the sheer number of carboxylic acids that we were getting across the entire time chromatogram here. We tend to kind of divide this 60-minute run up into before 20 minutes. So those are the more volatile compounds likely to come off in the earlier lifetime of the material. And then your last half of the chromatogram is the larger compounds that are going to be more slow and persistent to be coming off of the material. And we were seeing those as the carboxylic acids across the entire chromatogram, in addition to aldehydes and esters, not as favorable compounds either. Which meant when we got our Oddy test results out, surprise, surprise, not really. The lead coupons covered in variety of different types of corrosion. Didn't image super well, but our silver in paint A has some slight hints of brown tarnishing, and the copper, some really faint discoloration on the part of the coupon that hangs closer proximity to the sample. So not ideal. And at this point, we'd already been in conversation with Nancy, who had started reaching out to other colleagues of, all right, exhibits is telling us they are going to use a paint, just sanding the mounts was not an option. So what could we do to perhaps mitigate some of these volatiles that we're seeing and would be a concern and risk to the variety of collections that we have going on exhibit? A potential solution that was proposed was putting an acrylic top coat over the spray paints. So I'll go ahead and say the last data I was showing was after the paint's cured for about 10 days in a fume hood, so lots of airflow, and we're still getting all of that. Manufacturer on the spray cans were saying 30 minutes of cure time. But to do these top coats, I only let them cure a day, still above that manufacturer time, before just applying some matte acrylic medium over top. You can kind of see some of the gloss here on these bottom samples that have the acrylic medium compared to the no acrylic on the top. These did get a cure for a little bit longer before going through the volatiles and Oddy testing. Starting off with the volatiles testing, immediate difference with that top coat on there for both paint A and B that are in the gray lines. We're going from thousands of part per million of compounds down to the hundreds, much more ideal. We were still seeing some carboxylic acids with the top coating on them, but significantly reduced in the number of them and their overall concentration. So it's not perfect, but this is looking a lot more promising than we had been seeing previously. And then when our Oddy test came out, paint B especially here was very exciting, as our lead coupon went from an unsuitable rating to a pass. And silver looked good. There was, I think, one coupon had a slight hint of lightening, so it got an overall temporary rating. Paint A was kind of interesting in that there's definitely less corrosion that we were seeing here on our lead coupons, but it's still an unsuitable rating. And honestly, the silver here got a little bit worse, and the copper maintained where it was. So it was really interesting for us to see that with the volatile side of GCMS, for both material or both paints, the acrylic top coat was very beneficial in reducing what would have been the overall off-gassing, but the Oddy test was showing us that it really does matter which paint is being used as your undercoat. Even if you're putting a coating on something, you still need to be careful about what it is coating. It's not putting an acrylic coating does show promise and benefit. I believe that's what actually was done on the final mounts that went into the exhibit, but it's definitely not put a coating on it and everything will be 100% fine all the time, which was interesting to see with our results here. And with that, once again, big thank you to Nancy for all of her collaboration and work with us on this, as well as Ken and Homer. And with that, I will go ahead and hand this off to our next presenter. Don't have my talk from me, but yes.
Sorry, I can't turn my video on because it's disabled, but this is Beth Holford and Susan Field. Hi, Susan. I'm going to start off. We want to thank you for the opportunity. Sorry. Oh, yeah, here we are. Susan, Beth. Thanks for the opportunity to present to you today. So during the pandemic, Beth and I and our former Mellon Fellow, Lauren Osmond, revised the materials list for exhibit case interiors. And we relied heavily on shared expertise from a wide variety of museum colleagues. And so we want to share our story with you today. In the early aughts, NMAI was preparing about 4,000 objects for 4 inaugural exhibits at at the new museum on the National Mall, and to provide a unified guidelines across 4 exhibition teams with different contract designers and fabricators. Conservators compiled, I lost my space. Conservators compiled a document of approved materials for case interiors taken primarily from Hatchfield's Pollutants in the Museum Environment and the National Park Service's Exhibit Conservation Guidelines, which were both indispensable resources. We Oddy tested many exhibit case materials, and this graphic image of a destroyed lead coupon was key to convincing our project managers to respec materials late in the game across all of the exhibitions and gift shops. In 2003, between 2003 and 2014, we updated the list at least 4 times. We used 3 versions of the Oddy test. We shared our document and Oddy test results with museum colleagues and contractors widely. However, we were not allowed to place this information on NMAI's website because it could be construed as product defamation or endorsement. In 2018, we stopped issuing the document because we could not keep up with the Oddy testing or the product updates. We did devise a simplified document listing materials not to use, but our constituents wanted to know what they could use. We reasoned at the time that current information was now available through the newly formed Material Working Group's AIC wiki pages, which at the time our constituents found hard to navigate. In 2020, management tasked conservation with reviving our approved materials list, driven largely by our community loans program to tribal museums who could benefit from having a guiding document with updated web content. And some of you probably heard from us because we surveyed many colleagues, both inside and outside the Smithsonian, to learn what materials people were and were not using inside their cases. We encouraged participation from exhibit designers, fabricators, mount makers, project managers, because we wanted to have useful data, product workability, affordability, accessibility, and also preferably non-toxic materials. And this slide shows some of our results, which were very interesting. So with guidance from our colleagues, we revived the old document with updated information, active links, and colorful new branding. Here's our document at the left. We tried to make it user-friendly and digestible. The materials categories are in the table of contents, and we're going to look at this section and focus on rigid polymer-based boards. On the left, you can see each category has an overview, materials not recommended, a chart of recommended materials with comments on the workability and function, and the product testing date, preferably within the last 5 years. So here's a closer look at that coma cell. We also linked to the product page, so you can just link directly to find out more information about that product. In this case, they have a full data sheet for the product. Frequently, manufacturers will also include the safety data sheets on their websites, which are really, really helpful to review. They can be a hefty read, but the main information that's important to look for is in section 3, which offers the composition information of the product, which you can see an example of in the top right, as well as section 10, where you'll find the hazardous decomposition products, such as formaldehydes and acids. And you can see an example of that in the bottom right. The last column of the table in our document gives information on materials testing, specifying what test was used, when and where it was tested, and most importantly, whether it passes or fails. Details on this testing can be accessed through active links here that takes you to the materials testing results on the AIC wiki page, which we heard about earlier in this session. The database compiles materials testing results submitted by collections care colleagues from around the world. Testers are encouraged to share their data, so results are always being added. Formulations change, so it's good to check back often. The database is easy to use and it's accessible for everyone. It has two different views for viewing the data, the table view as well as the card view. Here's a closer look at the table view. You can search for your product in the search box in the upper right. Each entry lists the material name, manufacturer and supplier, test results, whether it passes, fails, or can be used temporarily. It lists the date when it was tested and what institution tested it. The Oddy coupon images on the right let the user review the results for themselves so that they can ultimately make determinations on those determinations for themselves. You can click on each of these images to blow it up to get a closer look. If there are no images, there's often a description of the coupon results, so you can get a snapshot. All of these columns can be sorted by date, tester, material, etc., making it a very handy tool to use. So here you can see the Comacell is at the top of the list. It was tested in 2020 by the Met, and they determined that it was suitable for use. Here again, for viewing is the card view format. Again, you can search in the upper right search box, and your results can be filtered on the left. Another useful resource, which we learned about a little earlier in this session, was the Cameo website. And we use this website ourselves to inform our document. You can search through the materials database link for all sorts of material related to art, making, and conservation. This entry for Comacell has product images, details on the physical and chemical properties, as well as common applications, health and safety risks. And it also includes helpful tips, such as working properties. There's also an entry for materials testing, and this links again to the AIC materials testing results. So this is a helpful resource all in one. Just like the AIC materials database, it's also constantly being updated, so check back often. Our approved materials list is a living document that we hope will be especially useful for all of our colleagues. Selecting appropriate case materials is a universal challenge for all of us. And it works best when we have input and feedback from all perspectives. This keeps the document useful and practical. We update the document every year, thanks to our steady inflow of new fellows and interns who assist us with making sure links are still working and not broken, and making sure that all of the testing data is up to date. And we hope that in the future, we can put this resource on our website so it can be live and people can just easily grab it from the web. But currently, we send it to people who inquire about it. In addition, Shelly Uhlir, who you heard from earlier, she liked the idea of this usable document. And so her and the former fellow Lauren Osmond worked together to create a recommended materials list for Mountmaking materials. So hence we have one for in-case materials as well as for Mountmaking materials. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers for their talks. Super interesting. We have a lot of questions that have come in through the chat. I have some questions, and I think we have about 40 minutes for this Q&A. So I'm Megan. I am an object conservator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I didn't say that earlier, and my co-moderator on this Q&A panel session is Jennifer Herman. I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to say
hi.
Hello.
Hi. I'm one of the heritage scientists at the National Archives, and I'm excited to help get you the answers to your questions. We also we're taking questions for everybody that gave talks, as well as we have two other people joining the panelists. I don't know if Ashley and Mare want to unmute and put their cameras on so that they can say hello for a minute.
Hello, I should be unmuted and my camera should be on. Yes, no?
Yeah.
Yes.
We hear you.
Yes, yes.
And Ashley?
Yeah, looks like I'm up. Yeah, I actually have been swimming in materials studies my entire professional life, I guess, because I was at NMAI during a lot of that testing, and then at the Getty for testing of GCI, and even did work for the Southwest Museum in LA, which also did a lot of testing. It's always been a critical part of the stuff I do.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you, everyone, for being on this panel. So, let's see. In terms of questions, I know there were a couple questions that came in about testing. So maybe this one came in for Devin. Can you speak to the difference between the traditional Oddy PTU ratings and the actual on-the-ground decisions about whether or not to use a material? It is often important for us to apply interpretation to those ratings, considering, for example, whether or not to use T materials in P exhibits.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, it's something that actually comes up pretty frequently, and touches on the point I raised at the end of my talk about collaboration and acceptable compromise. So occasionally you will encounter a situation where, as the Oddy tester, you'll be provided with a range of different inks, for example, and all of them test poorly. But the exhibit labels and graphics need to be printed with something, and the inks are the only thing that are going to work for the exhibition design. So what we've done in the past is compare the material sample coupons to one another to establish a ranking within the temporary or unsuitable category. So, for example, this ink earned an unsuitable rating, but it's much closer to the temporary threshold versus an ink that has a decisive, horrible, unsuitable rating that has completely disintegrated the lead coupon, for example. I would feel better sending the less tragic, unsuitable rating ink into the field because I think it's reasonable to speculate that the corrosion ranking might be reflected in the field performance of the inks within those categories. And then I guess another thing to consider is the intended amount of the amount and intended use of the material in the display case in the airspace. So for another example, if it's a very small amount of a double-sided tape that's going to be pressed between two materials and have very little of it actually exposed to the airspace, I'm less concerned about the Oddy test result of that material than I would be about, say, a paint or something that is going to cover the entire interior of the display case. So yeah, it's always critical to understand the intended use and amount of the material. And that's a great question. And if anyone else wants to chime in on that, that's what I had off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'll definitely chime in on the context is key, at least for us in terms of dictating what, or not dictating, but recommending a material for use or not use somewhere is, for instance, here at the library, we have our large offsite storage modules that are like football field size, tons of active filtration and sorbent media in the filter cartridges. But then we have our exhibit cases, which range from more temporary built ones with no active airflow to then the actual storage spaces. And so we're always trying to take in context what that airflow is. What are the type of collection objects? Like, for instance, is it something we know would be more susceptible to sulfur or not sulfur? That might affect, like, oh, if we're going to have a musical instrument with lead solder joints, we really want to be careful about the amount of acids and other stuff. So it's always kind of at least just because it's temporary or unsuitable doesn't automatically qualify or disqualify it. It's the bigger picture that we look at.
I would just add on to that to say that it's interesting. I worked with the conservation guidelines part of upgrading and updating the CD-ROM that was put out years ago. And if you look at that, one of the things that was included extensively was ventilating cases. And in the years since, we moved towards like microclimate kind of casework as a standard, and it's just recently that for a number of reasons that's being changed. Even at an AIC a few years ago, Stephen Weintraub even submitted to saying it's like, okay, you know, and under the right circumstances, you know, that's, you know, an option, and that makes a huge difference, obviously.
Yeah, thank you. I think along those lines, there was another question that came in for Julia. The question is there a provision or classification for Oddy tested materials for open air versus closed case usage? For example, padding for pins used to secure large sculptures displayed on open pedestals or plinths. So maybe like, how is the context that we're all talking about right now, the bigger picture, how is that kind of taken into consideration in the benchmarking project?
So the benchmarking project aims to really understand the chemistry behind the Oddy test and be more quantitative and objective about defining boundaries. And so I would say that the sort of nuance that comes into making an actual decision about which materials get used, I would just echo what Devin and Ashley and others, Kelly, I think, have said about really considering the context. So I would say our approach when something is inside of the art envelope, for example, is like best in class. We're pretty stringent about finding really the best option when it comes to low emissions, no reactive chemicals. That is a huge priority for us. When something is outside of the art envelope, then we are looking for best available. So sort of more like what Devin described with maybe you have 10 different options and you pick the least bad one. And you know, we're always trying to improve that process. And if we can get best in class, then we will for any project. But that context about proximity to the object and amount of material, those are both like huge considerations for us. So they definitely come into play. But I would say from an Oddy benchmarking standpoint and how we're trying to define the boundaries, we're not imposing any sort of interpretation on that. We're trying to understand where the boundaries might lie and kind of standardize, work towards standardizing the Oddy test. But the interpretation, I would say, it really has to be a collaborative conversation between the folks at that institution.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at the question, and it says it sounds like it might be a question of the padding material being in direct contact with the sculptures. So I think in general, direct contact is the bigger concern versus, you know, closed airspace versus open airspace. So especially for a material that had a kind of an unfavorable Oddy test rating. So direct contact might be a situation where you want to consider alternative materials or an inner barrier layer. And then that said, it depends also on what the padding material is and what the sculptures are made of, because the compatibility of those materials is going to be important to consider too. And to my knowledge, you know, there's no hard and fast rule about airflow. There are no specific provisions because there's so much gray area in Oddy testing, but you know, there are things you can do to mitigate when you're in a situation where you have to use a material, like maybe it's the least bad material, but you still have to use it. There are things you can do to mitigate it, and some other people have mentioned them already, like increasing the airflow in a display case within reason, as long as you can still maintain the appropriate relative humidity and security in the case. But other things you might consider are adding barrier layers like Marvel Seal or Mylar, rotating out the unsuitable material on a more frequent basis, or including scavengers like activated charcoal in the display case envelope, and supplementary monitoring is always a good idea too, like adding AD strips, acetate deterioration strips, or new metal coupons somewhere in the display case, just to sort of keep checks on how things are going in there. Are all things you can do in a suboptimal situation.
Thanks for adding that, Devin. I didn't realize the question was about in contact. Eric also just put this in the chat, but we at the Met conduct contact Oddy testing as well when something's going to be in direct contact with an object. And so that's similar, except instead of hanging from the coupon holder, the coupons are directly contacting whatever that material is. And you will find that you get different results. And so I would second that recommendation to add a barrier between the material and the object.
We always used to do at NMAI, we always used to do in contact and no contact as just a routine, just a routine testing. But I think it just got to be too much for us with the volume that we were testing. So then we just went to no contact. But it was very helpful to have that added information, and it's nice to, I just think it's good to have it included, like in the Oddy wiki, if it was in contact, to have those results reported.
Okay, for our next question is for Shelly. Could you go through the replacement solvent process? Just 70-30 of the two solvents by volume is how the question reads.
So, well, we haven't gotten to that point yet, but I would assume, I mean, it won't be perfect, right? Because if I've started with the 70-30 solvent mix, the acetone's probably evaporating faster than the ethanol. I don't know. I would go ask Beth and Sue and the conservators about it. But what my tendency would be to mix up whatever amount more that I want to add of a 70-30 mixture, and then just kind of pour it in until it has the right viscosity. Does that seem right to you guys who
Yeah,
do this for a living?
I think if you're trying to replace salt, you can never perfectly replace the solvent. I think that especially for working properties, if that's the priority, is the working property, the viscosity, then you would slowly add solvent to until you get that viscosity that you're looking for. And you can add a mixture of acetone ethanol, roughly, if you still want the length of time for the working capability. But, I personally don't know any perfect way to replace the exact mixture, but I think it's in a sense just seeing how it works, how it handles.
And as a chemist, I think that's completely acceptable. So that sounds like a good solution to me.
Thank you. And also, I actually, in terms of the mount making purposes, a lot of mount makers I know just use acetone anyway. So if it works for you to keep it simple, then keep it simple. For me, I just had user error challenges with the acetone because it evaporates so quickly that I'd get a lot of bubbling, and I didn't really like the effect on the mounts that I was doing, but it might have been how I was doing it too.
So for the next question, this one is for Mayor. As a mount maker and a business owner, can you speak to the complexity of sourcing materials to meet the high level of criteria the museum community has between aesthetics, working properties, and preservation, especially since manufacturers can change product materials without notifying folks?
Well, yeah, it's completely, it's a total conundrum. There's certainly a lot less control than we would want to have. Most of the exhibits that we worked on as mount makers were quite temporary, so that helped things to a certain extent. When we undertake looking for products that need Oddy tests, you know, we could go through a lot of discussions with the vendors, like, can you know, tell us that this is the formula that you will be using? And some people are more able to do that, and other people certainly aren't. The plastics industry is a great example of, I always think of it as like a brownie, you know, it's a brownie, but there are 100,000 different brownie recipes. The best we can do is just sort of say, honestly, if you have something that's super sensitive and you have the time and you have the resources, do your Oddy tests. But for us, in terms of keeping product on the shelf, and the Oddy test takes a month at its very least, plus all the time on either side to get things into testing and then the analysis on the other side, it's very, very difficult. There's no two ways about it. It's very difficult. And I appreciate the patience that you all have with it. We do the best we can on it, but there's no hard and fast.
Well, I'm going to throw this question out to all of the panelists. When you have identified a need, but not yet a suitable material, what resources or avenues are you using to brainstorm a new material to try?
Testing results table is a great place to start. It's you can think of it as a repository of things that people have already tested, and you know, regardless of how they tested, if the results are, you know, older, it's probably worth retesting, but it's a pretty quick and easy way to compile sometimes a pretty extensive list of options for whatever you're looking for. That's usually where I would start.
Tough question. Identified a need, but not a suitable material. Anyone else have any
I guess
ideas?
it depends on what it means by not suitable, because like I would go back to what Julia talked about before, picking the least worst option. Like sometimes we just run into the time frame of like, we don't have time to be testing more. We've already tested a bunch of things. Something needs to go down. At that point, what other environmental kind of mitigation techniques could we implement? We've had that happen with a floor tile adhesive. None of them were good, so it was the least worst that we had to pick.
I'll also add that our conservators are often recommending materials that they really like for various reasons to test, whether it's because it's more sustainable or just functionally it's something that they had used at a past institution and really are interested in using it again here. So if we have the capacity, even if it's not for a specific project, we try and test those materials and add them to our database. We add them to the database regardless, but when we find something good, then that's always lucky. But yeah, that totally depends on having the capacity and conservators who give you good recommendations and the ability to test super regularly.
I just wanted to add about that coupon that I showed, the one I think we think we had the best destroyed lead coupon, which was like almost, you know,
Goo.
It was goo. Yeah, we had some that completely fell apart and fell into the bottom of the jar. But we had to select something, you know, so that's what we did. It was another wood product that failed the least, and that was what got spec'd, and it seemed to work out okay, because I think you have to remember with the Oddy test, I mean, you're not displaying things in 80% relative humidity at 60 degrees centigrade. you're displaying things in ambient conditions, even if they might be in an enclosed case. So, I mean, there's that to consider.
And I'm going to broadcast Eric's comment that he just added to the chat, which is that like project managers or exhibition designers, if we really can't find something that we're happy with, we'll ask them to go out and research and provide additional options for us to test. And it doesn't always happen, but a lot of times it does. And so that can be a good strategy as well.
Do you have the time for that when you're facing an installation? Is always the question that comes to mind for me as a mount maker.
Yeah, not always. And sometimes in a pinch, we will run like every other test that we can. So we'll do volatiles testing by GCMS to get a sense of which chemicals are present in that material. We'll do the quick microchemical tests like the LAT, the sodium azide test to see if there are any sulfides in the material. So we try and get as complete of a picture as we can. But yeah, time is often the enemy in these cases. But we're trying, and I think if you communicate really regularly with the departments and can get them to notify you as soon as possible when something's in the pipeline, that's also part of our approach so that we have time, or like assuming everything fails, let's give ourselves as much time as we can to get alternatives. But yeah, it's a work in progress. It doesn't always happen.
Sort of tangential to that is we have, I think it's stated on the website or has been put out there that if we get certain results, and if there fails, we don't put that in the product line, but other people, if they're going to do testing, get other results. And if they let us know, then the whole aspect of crowdsourcing, I mean, it's amazing that all these wikis are available, but also, to be in conversation with us, let us know what sort of results you got so that we can share them around or do further exploration. It's always a help.
I'll just kind of tack on to that is like, if it winds up with exhibit deadlines that we can't find a better alternative, it means that we kind of take note that this is a blind spot we have. So then we start looking for, like, for instance, the paint that we liked, it got discontinued. So then we had a project where when we had some downtime, we were just getting every type of paint out there that we could so that we could try and be prepared for what we knew was going to be a reoccurring issue for us, and just kind of work on those when we have the downtime.
Right.
I want to turn to coatings for brass. There were a couple questions for Shelly or Pierre-Luc. What about not coating brass? Is that a suitable option? Because we heard about a lot of, cool ways to maybe coat things with better materials or do a layered system to kind of knock down on some of those VOCs from unsuitable primers. But what are aside from accepting paint, what about not coating?
Yeah, absolutely. When I was first doing the research into moving away from my toxic xylene soup that I was using before, I started asking around, to folks who had been early on in the mount making world, and like, why do we coat the mounts again? Because we just do it as a matter of practice, right? Because it's just what we do. And so as we looked into that, it's you don't have to, right? As long as you're putting some kind of barrier, you're not going to put metal right against the object. If you have some other kind of padding material and your brass is clean, and your solder joints are clean, and you don't have any kind of galvanic reaction situation, where you have multiple metals together, or, and if you're in a general museum environment where, there's not a lot of humidity changes and stuff going on, then all those things being equal, then it's often okay to not coat your brass. That said, the coating, if we can find ones that work well for us and and are safe within the case. It is helpful, you know, when you're bending brass, even if you're filing and sandblasting and all that stuff, there may be little nicks and dings that the coating can kind of help to smooth out. You know, and it does help with some of the paint adhesion sometimes. Sometimes the coatings actually make it too slippery and it's not helpful. So it depends kind of on what your process is. But I don't know if anybody wants to add to that, but that was kind of what I understood.
Maybe maybe I'll say that it depends also on the material. Not all the metals are reacting the same way depending on the context, and depending also on the finish that you have on your material, especially if you sandblast it to have a uniform finish. For brass, steel, or stainless steel, you'll probably have to handle it with gloves as much as possible, because fingerprints can just reappear over time by making some kind of patinas on the surface of the object, some small oxidation or tarnishing. So I think it depends also, because if you have a very polished finish, I think it could be more resistant to stains that could occur. Or also, there's also the option of patinas, which could be good because it's a kind of controlled oxidation. It's not a coating in itself. So this could be an option as well.
There are a lot of mount makers that use those, and I don't have experience with those, but I understand that that often those are then coated afterward. Also, I don't know if you have to, but if you're ending up with a coating anyway, then yeah, you're coating. And I'm more talking about like not coating if you're going to use an acrylic paint surface or something like that. But totally agree with you, Pierre-Luc, that if you're wanting a shiny, perfect brass kind of look, then yeah, it's another reason to coat.
But then sometimes I had, especially when we're making last minute mounts, you know, it's a lone object and it gotta go on display, and you need to build a mount in the same day and close the display case. Most of the time, I just don't coat it or just don't put anything on it, just to make sure that there's not any off-gassing in the display case, depending on the object I need to mount and the time lapse I have for drying time and curing.
We have a question for BJ now. It's about the PLA. Somebody wrote that they'd used PLA with copper and heat cured it. What type of PLA was used that didn't pass the Oddy test?
We've been using our 3D printers are by a company from Ultimaker, and they make a whole range of filaments. So we tend to use their filaments. We don't have to, but we've been getting good results. But we did test the PLA along with the ABS, both white and black, and it didn't pass, which seems to be somewhat consistent with some of the listings I've seen on the materials website from others that have tested PLA, that it hasn't passed. But again, that was just our particular test with that brand. And we did a white PLA, which within the ABS version did pass. So I don't know. It's a good question.
There was another question about the 3D printing process. Forgive me because I don't know too much about this, but someone asked, has anyone tested resin bath printers for material suitability as opposed to filament printers?
Not that I don't know. I haven't heard of anyone doing that. But I would be really curious. My sense is that it probably won't. I don't know. only from the process, from what I know about the process, it could be, I don't know. I haven't tested it. I haven't heard of anyone testing it yet. It would be great if it did. But I have heard that there is some environmental health hazards or cautions around resin printers. I don't know. Again, I wish I had a better answer for that, but the print quality is considerably better than the filament. So if it did pass, or if there were certain resins, yeah, that would be great to know about. I actually have one question myself, sort of to the group, about looking at potential filament materials. And I was wondering the thoughts in terms of, there's a lot of filaments that are coming out, and it's hard to tell sometimes what might be a good one to try. But I'm wondering, like, if something is listed as being safe in contact with food, if that might be like an indicator that maybe that's something worth testing. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing that out there. If that might be an initial option, just to try to narrow down some of the amount of materials that are out there, at least for like the printer filaments, but maybe with other materials as well.
Sometimes when we've not had time to test a lot of things, I've looked and I've used something that was approved for like medical or food use, because like, as we've all said, it gets really difficult. And if you have no time, I've erred on saying, well, it's people safe, like even for eating. And I mean, some things that are safe for people aren't safe for objects, but I do think it's at least a place to begin.
That's great. That's kind of what my, that I was hoping there would be some correlation, but that's good to hear that might be an indicator.
Julia looks like she has something to add.
Well, I don't want to contradict too much, but and this is a different application, but I recently was doing a project on volatiles in the gallery space, and for the purposes of breathing in volatiles, the human health, the Venn diagram of human health hazards and reactive hazardous chemicals for the artwork had a very small sliver of overlap. I would say, like benzenes, toluenes, xylenes, those type of things that can be carcinogenic and were like EPA limited, are hydrocarbons that are actually pretty non-reactive for art objects, even though they're bad for us to breathe in. And so, and then, acetic acid, which is vinegar, essentially, concentration limits apply in terms of safety, but we eat it and it's pretty bad for art objects. And so I don't have a definitive answer there, but at least for the projects that I've worked on, I haven't found like the human health safety and the art object safety to be like a particularly useful, overlap in terms of the molecules that are relevant.
And I agree that as I said, like they really, and Julia said it better than I had, that there isn't a whole lot of overlap, but I still have found that if you have to err on like using something, it's a starting point, and we usually still at least check if we can find the ingredients, and obviously if it had acetic acid or something like that in it, we would never use it because that's something that's fairly easy to test for. So we still try to run a few quick tests to see if we can spot bad players. But I have gone to something like that because there just was nothing else and there was no time to do a deeper dive. For another question we had for Kelly, Were water-based paint sprays ever tested? We have used some to prevent bad interactions with foam for a children's exhibit, and I wonder if they would be more stable. I think that's an interesting question because, again, like often we think of water-based as being safer, but sometimes they also test badly. So can you comment on that, Kelly?
I don't know if we've probably had some water-based paints come through. It was definitely not a part of what was submitted to us for this specific project or exhibit case. I think there was 3, and then we wound up getting like a slow trickle of other spray paints that had been submitted during the course of doing all the acrylic top coating. And a lot of them were like your typical, more solvent-based coatings. And honestly, getting back to kind of the solvent-based isn't necessarily a bad thing, because if I think it's going to flash off faster, it will come down to kind of what is the actual formulation of the paint itself outside of the solvents that is more of the problem child. So can't remember offhand if we tested water-based pigment or paints at all, but it definitely was not part of the thing submitted for the Treasures Gallery.
Let's see. There are a few questions left that we haven't got to. Maybe the 3D for the 3D printing things. I thought that was super interesting how you all are using that technology to just problem solve and prepare mounts without having to use the actual object. So the question that came in was, how expensive is it to make 3D models? Do you use existing scans, or is that part of the cost?
The actual printing is very inexpensive. The printers can be on the more expensive side, but the filaments themselves typically run, I don't know, anywhere from like $30 to $70 a spool, and a spool can provide quite a bit of material to print objects with. But yeah, it's the scanning. For scanning, we typically do our own scanning. But you know, if an institution has an existing model for us, yeah, definitely we will use that. And it tends to be becoming more prevalent that institutions are doing 3D imaging of their collections. So it's becoming more accessible for us.
And if you were doing the scanning in-house, would it be like, do Mountmakers do the scans, or is that a conservator using that?
It's started with Mountmaking, but our conservators are utilizing the equipment quite a bit now for different projects, and it's really becoming quite a great tool. There's some analytical opportunities that are being explored using 3D scans, and that doesn't involve any printing. It's purely an analytical digital thing. But yeah, it's we started out with very, very low cost, almost do-it-yourself scanning, just to try to understand the possibilities, and you know, quickly learned that as with like camera equipment, you know, the more investment you make into the equipment, the better results you'll get. And eventually we ended up with scanners from a company called Artec, which is, you know, they're really an industry standard for scanning equipment, and they've been super reliable, and the software is great. And yeah, we're very happy with it.
I think there was just a question about if photogrammetry was a suitable level of detail, or have you found it needs to be laser scanned?
Also a great question. our experience with photogrammetry, again, it's really equipment. The better the camera, the better the results. The software continually gets better and better. The one issue for us is having, really accurate dimensional information, especially for Mountmaking, and also for some of the conservation projects. So photogrammetry, it's very crucial to incorporate a scale that the software can, really make sure that the model is being created at an accurate size. Whereas the scanners, it's built right into it, so you don't have to worry about that issue. But yeah, photogrammetry it's a great option.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions, and this is a question for all of our fabricators. Based on your experiences, do you feel that the material selection conversations are similar when it comes to other areas of fabrication, like packing?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't catch it.
Based on your experiences, do you feel the material selection conversations that we use for exhibits can be extended to storage or packing or other areas of fabrication? And by extension, are there materials that are used in those that might also be good for us to consider?
I think that's definitely the case, especially in terms of sustainability. The things you use in storage, have to be stable, and they provide usually 3/4 of the support it needs. If you're, have an adequately supported storage mount, what's missing for travel is something to hold it into that opening. And that's kind of the gold standard. If you can do something that gets continually used, if you can use your display mount, especially earthquake seismic mounts tend to be a little more robust and more suitable for a partial storage mount. So that's something that should be utilized more. I think it's being utilized more all the time.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think the designing flexibility is really crucial, making sure that it can facilitate a lot of different display orientations, but also for storage. We don't typically ship objects with mounts. Sometimes we do, but it's not generally done. But yeah, for storage, definitely.
It would have to be included in the design. What I remember I was lucky enough in 1999, I think it was, to be at AIC. I could only be there because I was a commercial person in a booth, but Eleanor Onage at the Guggenheim was dealing with Donald Judd sculptures that if you contacted them in any way, they were a nightmare. They're just raw metal, polished metal. And she had a system to where it could be supported and stored within a container that could also be shipped, and that was used as an installation jig too, where basically throughout its life it never needed to be touched again. And if you can accomplish that, you get gold stars. And it was also where Intercept was one of the early applications of Intercept material. That was a classic.
Well, I think we're almost out of time for the Q&A panel. I'll throw in one. I don't think it was answered in the chat. It's a quick one for Pierre-Luc. Can you share the airbrush type and brand that you use, and how do you clean it when you're done?
Okay, so for the airbrush type and brand, I think I already posted in the chat.
Oh, okay, sorry.
After no worries. And for cleaning, it's kind of simple since Laravel can dissolve in so many solvent. I just use ethanol because it's kind of the easiest solvent for me to use. It's not very harmful, and it's very soft, and so I just essentially dismantle the whole airbrush and just clean it with small brushes and ethanol. It works pretty well, but it's kind of a long process. It's for cleaning. There's a lot of small parts in the airbrush.
Great, thank you. Well, I think this concludes our Q&A. Thank you to all of our panelists and everyone who asked questions. I'm glad. I think we got to like pretty much loop in all aspects, all different sides of this conversation in terms of scientists, conservators, mount makers, fabricators. Yeah, and it's been a pleasure. I'm going to turn it over to Peter. He has some final remarks and some next steps.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It has been a solid 2.5 hours, and I'm really excited for where we're going with this. I am going to give you guys some really important information because it's discussing what we're going to be doing from here on out. The biggest one of those is this is sort of a sneak peek intro, testing the waters for a much larger virtual summit that we're going to be doing in November of this year. And so that's going to be the 9th annual meeting for the Materials Working Group. It plans to be a virtual meeting this year, and it's going to be sometime in November, although that date is not totally hammered out just yet. So what we need you all to do, and if Jen Bosworth, if you can post the Materials Working Group sign up link again, sign up so we can keep you all informed about when that's going to be, and then also give you guys more information about what that summit is actually going to be focused on. Beyond mount making, we know that it's going to be on mounts, and those typically take place over the course of a few days also. So it's going to be a lot of content. So this is just sort of a starter for that. The other thing is we ask that you continue to participate in our surveys and inquiries as we put them out. We do read them. So as Shelly showed you the results from the padding survey that you all responded to and the coding survey before that, we do aggregate that, look at it, and talk about it at our conferences and at these sort of meetings. So please continue to do that. There is also the possibility that between now and November, some of that content is going to be built based on the responses from you all. So if you see a survey or if you see a topic come up that we want to have more information on, you're probably definitely going to be populating some of the content that we'll be going into in November. Potentially, we may even be doing some material testing. So if you have any suggestions for materials, I saw lots in the chat, especially lots of them relating to 3D printing and some of those new technologies. So please respond. Feel free to use the IMF email address if you have any thoughts or suggestions for things. No promises, but there is always the potential that we can get some round robin testing in prior to November. One other thing that I really want to reiterate that Megan already talked about is that the IMF team behind the scenes has been working hard to update its materials webpage specifically. We're trying to make a webpage that more meets the needs of our community, our mount makers. And so what we're designing, although it's not currently active, is a page that is organized more by type or use. So if you're looking for a resin coating like B72 but doesn't bubble, you can basically search down through coatings and sort of go down that rabbit hole, and then go into resin coatings and go down that rabbit hole and kind of find a potential solution through using that. And so we're going to do that for all of the materials that we can think of that we're currently using. We're also potentially going to be, once we get down to the final page for each material, you're going to have all the links to all the various sites that we've discussed many times today, like Cameo and Wiki, but also all the past conference presentations of relevant information that may have touched on this material, used this material, had suggestions, or dissuaded people of using this specific material. also biblio resources, things like that. But one thing that I'm most excited about is starting to put together a gallery of images and videos for use of materials, because one thing can be used a variety of different ways. And so if we have something that is testing well, it's great to be able to see how different people are using it. So there is potential in the distant future that we can be calling upon our community to give input and content that we can then put on our webpage so that people can see how everyone's using different materials. The recordings for this session should be available soon-ish, so look for those. We'll be sending those out within, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I saw it in the chat, within the next couple of weeks probably. And then finally, use the resource links, because people are working hard on them. And you know, you not only do you have IMF as the forum, but you also have it as a web page that we're working on updating. But Cameo and the AIC Wiki are incredible resources. So I really encourage you all to use it, interact with it, collaborate within those spaces, because they're really important. And so Jen or Elizabeth or Shelly or anyone else, if you have anything else to add, please chime in. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. This was fantastic. We had so many people show up. I saw like 280 names on the participant list, which is great.
Nothing to add, just thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. I think, wasn't there something we were going to say about future collaborations and maybe
We are planning to.
Yeah. We're not there yet.
We're not quite there yet. We're going to be sending, we have everybody's email address since you've registered for this. So when we have more information about possibilities for collaboration, we'll be sending that out to the distribution list that we have now. So we're still that's still in the works. And for sure, we're going to be having another basically forum like this during the materials working group in November, date and time to be announced. And all that information will go out to this group who have already registered, and we've got their emails. So look for that, and we'll update you as we have more information.
All right.
Thanks,
Goodbye,
everybody.
everyone.
Take care.